For more than a century, Canada's Western economy has operated with a boundary that rarely appears on maps. Long before a rail car crossed an international checkpoint or a ship entered foreign waters, Canadian goods had already passed through an invisible border, one embedded in steel, scheduling systems, port ownership, and freight contracts. Wheat harvested across Saskatchewan, barley grown in Alberta, minerals extracted from northern Manitoba, fertilizer refined in prairie plants. Almost all of it followed a predictable path. It moved south first. Only after crossing into the United States did it fan out toward global markets. This flow became so routine that it ceased to be questioned. It was described as efficient. It was justified as practical. It was framed as the natural consequence of geography. But it was none of those things. It was a consequence of infrastructure decisions made over decades, decisions that quietly transfer control over Canadian trade routes to another country. Railways determined where bulk commodities could move cheaply. Ports determined which volumes could be handled without delay. Logistics hubs determined storage, timing, and prioritization. Shipping schedules determined whether cargo waited days or weeks. Together, these systems did more than move goods. They shaped bargaining power. Canadian producers did not simply trade with the United States. They depended on American-owned and American-controlled infrastructure to reach the rest of the world. That dependence did not require coercion. It did not need threats. It operated automatically, invisibly, and continuously. And over time, it reshaped sovereignty. Prices were influenced by access fees. Negotiations were constrained by bottlenecks. Strategic decisions were made under the assumption that southern routes were unavoidable. When infrastructure dictates choices, power follows infrastructure. What Canada is attempting today, what very few advanced economies ever seriously attempt, is to reverse that logic, not by severing trade ties, not by retreating from globalization, but by rebuilding the physical pathways that determine who controls access to markets. This is not merely a story about steel rails or Arctic ports. It is about undoing a trade geometry that made American routes mandatory instead of optional. And the most unlikely tool in that effort is a rail line that for decades was described as obsolete, uneconomic, and irrelevant, Hudson Bay Railway. To understand why this railway now matters, it is necessary to understand why Western Canada went south in the first place, and why that pattern became so deeply entrenched that alternatives were dismissed as unrealistic. The Canadian prairies are among the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. They generate enormous surpluses of grain, oilseeds, and other bulk commodities. But productivity alone does not create global reach. Access to tidewater does. Bulk commodities are unforgiving. They require scale. They require predictable, low-cost transport. A single inefficiency, a delay at a port, a weight restriction on a rail line, a lack of storage capacity, can erase margins entirely. This reality rewards regions that invest early and continuously in high-capacity infrastructure. The United States did exactly that. Throughout the 20th century, American governments and private operators expanded ports along the Gulf Coast, the Great Lakes, and the Pacific Northwest. These ports were not just deep water facilities. They were integrated logistics ecosystems. Rail corridors feeding them were upgraded repeatedly to handle heavier loads, longer trains, and faster turnaround times. Storage, transshipment, and scheduling systems evolved together. Canada's investments followed a different pattern. Vancouver emerged as a dominant Pacific outlet, absorbing the bulk of Western Canadian exports heading to Asia. Eastern ports handled Atlantic trade. The Arctic, despite its strategic geography, remained peripheral, seasonal, lightly capitalized, and politically easy to ignore. The result was not merely a difference in infrastructure. It was a difference in behavior. When Canadian exporters face a choice, use a shorter route with limited capacity and higher uncertainty, or use a longer route with guaranteed throughput and established logistics, the decision was predictable. Over time, that decision hardened into assumption. Southern routes were not evaluated each year. They were taken for granted. And with each passing decade, American rail operators, port authorities, and logistics firms gained quiet influence over Canadian exports, not through policy, but through ownership and capacity. The Hudson Bay Railway was conceived as an answer to that imbalance. Built in the early 20th century, the line was intended to connect prairie producers directly to the port of Churchill on the shores of Hudson Bay. The vision was straightforward and bold. From central Canada to Europe, Churchill offered the shortest maritime distance. Ships leaving Hudson Bay could reach European ports faster than those routing to the Gulf of Mexico or even some Atlantic alternatives. Bypassing American ports promised more than savings. It promised autonomy. On paper, the concept was compelling. On maps, it looked inevitable. But infrastructure does not exist on paper or maps. It exists in geology, climate, and maintenance budgets. The railway crossed a terrain that tested the limits of early 20th century engineering. Permafrost did not behave as expected. Muskeg absorbed ballast like a sponge. Seasonal freeze-thaw cycles distorted track alignment. Extreme cold made steel brittle. Flooding routinely erased entire segments of the line. The port of Churchill itself was constrained. Its operating season was short. Its facilities were modest. Its ability to scale was limited by both climate and capital. Meanwhile, southern routes did not stand still. They improved relentlessly. Each improvement widened the gap between aspiration and reality for Churchill. By mid-century, the railway still functioned, but it no longer defined Canadian trade. It handled marginal volumes. It served niche purposes. It survived, but it did not lead. By the late 20th century, it was no longer seen as a strategic asset at all. The decision in the 1990s to sell the Hudson Bay Railway and the Port of Churchill for $1 was not an accounting exercise. It was a declaration. It declared that the federal government no longer believed this corridor mattered to Canada's future. It declared that maintaining sovereignty through northern infrastructure was not worth the cost. It declared that dependence on southern routes was acceptable. The symbolic price reflected a strategic judgment. This infrastructure had no meaningful economic value. Under private ownership, that judgment became self-fulfilling. Investment slowed. Maintenance was deferred. Standard declined. The railway operated just well enough to exist, but not well enough to compete. When severe flooding in 2017 washed out large sections of the line, the response revealed the underlying logic. The owner did not rebuild. From a narrow commercial perspective, it was not worth it. Churchill was cut off from surface transportation. The railway ceased to function. The corridor went dark. At that point, most observers assumed the story was over. They were wrong. When a coalition of First Nations communities and northern Manitoba municipalities acquired the Hudson Bay Railway and the Port of Churchill in 2018, the reaction from much of the policy and business community was restrained, even dismissive. The transaction was framed primarily through the lens of reconciliation. Indigenous ownership of legacy infrastructure was widely praised as symbolically important, socially meaningful, and politically overdue. But commercially, expectations were minimal. The prevailing assumption was that the railway had no realistic future as a major trade artery. Analysts viewed the acquisition as an act of stewardship rather than strategy. The line was still vulnerable to flooding. The port remained seasonal. Capital requirements were enormous. Global supply chains, it was argued, had already chosen their routes. In other words, history had already passed judgment. What this view failed to recognize was that infrastructure value is not fixed. It is conditional. It depends not only on physical condition, but on the geopolitical environment in which it operates. The Arctic Gateway Group did not acquire a profitable railway. It acquired an option that only becomes valuable when circumstances change. Crucially, the new ownership structure altered incentives. Unlike private operators focused solely on short-term returns, the coalition viewed the railway as a long-term regional and national asset. Its value was not measured only in quarterly revenue, but in connectivity, resilience, and strategic relevance. Maintenance resumed. Basic reliability improved. The line returned to operation. But even then, few believed this would evolve into something transformative. What changed everything was pressure from outside Canada. When trade relations with the United States began to deteriorate, through escalating tariff threats, increasingly protectionist rhetoric, and explicit challenges to Canadian economic autonomy, Ottawa faced a strategic inflection point. Canada could respond tactically, negotiate exemptions, file disputes, impose counter-tariffs, and hope the political cycle shifted. Or it could respond structurally, reduce exposure by changing the physical systems that created vulnerability in the first place. For decades, Canadian trade policy had focused on agreements, rules, and diplomacy. Infrastructure was treated as background, important but static. The new reality forced a different question to the forefront. How much sovereignty can a country claim if its exports rely on infrastructure it does not control? That question reframed the Hudson Bay Railway entirely. What had once been dismissed as marginal suddenly looked underutilized. What had been labeled uneconomic now appeared constrained not by demand, but by neglect. The railway was no longer evaluated on historical performance alone, but on future strategic necessity. In this context, investing in northern infrastructure stopped looking irrational. It began to look defensive, prudent, even urgent. Infrastructure became the battlefield, not because Canada sought confrontation, but because infrastructure determines who has options when negotiations fail. Rather than relying exclusively on retaliatory tariffs, Canadian policymakers began exploring how to make trade threats less effective in the first place. If exporters had alternatives, pressure lost potency. If routes were optional, leverage dissolved. The Hudson Bay Railway re-entered national strategy not as a relic of past ambition, but as a lever for future independence. To understand the significance of upgrading the Hudson Bay Railway to Class 1 standards, it is necessary to strip away the abstraction around railway classifications. These labels are not bureaucratic formalities. They define the physical limits of commerce. A Class 1 railway can carry heavy axle loads consistently. It supports long unit trains moving bulk commodities in volumes that make global trade economically viable. It allows higher speeds, tighter scheduling, and predictable transit times. Most importantly, it signals reliability, the single most critical factor for companies making long-term logistics commitments. Historically, the Hudson Bay Railway operated far below this threshold. Weight restrictions limited cargo types. Track instability constrained speed. Maintenance uncertainty made planning risky. Even when the line was operational, it could not compete with southern corridors designed explicitly for scale. Upgrading to Class 1 standards therefore represents not an incremental improvement, but a categorical transformation. This upgrade involves rebuilding the railway from the ground up, literally. Track beds are engineered to accommodate permafrost dynamics rather than fight them. Materials are selected not for average conditions, but for extremes. Bridges and culverts are reinforced to withstand flooding that once caused total failure. But the most profound shift is invisible. The integration of continuous digital monitoring transforms how the railway functions. Sensors embedded along the route detect ground movement in real time. Ground-penetrating radar maps subsurface changes. LiDAR creates precise three-dimensional models of track geometry. Drones conduct routine inspections across vast, inaccessible stretches. Artificial intelligence analyzes this data to predict failures before they occur. This is not maintenance in the traditional sense. It is anticipation. Instead of reacting to washouts and derailments, crews intervene during planned maintenance windows. Instead of sudden shutdowns, the railway operates with managed risk. In hostile environments, this distinction is decisive. This is how infrastructure survives, not by resisting nature, but by adapting to it intelligently. With Class 1 standards in place, the Hudson Bay Corridor crosses a threshold it never reached before: competitiveness. Geography, long dismissed as insufficient, suddenly becomes an advantage. The maritime distance from Churchill to Europe is shorter than from many southern ports. For bulk commodities, where margins are thin and volumes are massive, even small reductions in transport distance matter. Grain benefits immediately. Potash benefits even more. Minerals and energy products, which are extremely sensitive to transport costs, see step-change improvements in feasibility. Extended Arctic shipping seasons compound these gains. Icebreaker support and evolving climate conditions expand the operational window. What was once a narrow 4-month season now stretches toward 5 or 6 months, with planning assumptions increasingly treating Churchill as a regular, not exceptional, outlet. Reliability changes behavior more than incentives ever could. Producers do not shift routes because governments encourage them to. They shift because the numbers work and the risks are manageable. Once companies experience consistent performance through a new corridor, they incorporate it into baseline planning. It stops being an experiment and becomes part of normal operations. That is when dependence truly erodes. The Hudson Bay Railway does not need to replace southern routes to matter. It only needs to make them optional. Optionality alters negotiations. Optionality reshapes pricing. Optionality redistributes power. And that is why the economics now work. Not because the railway is nostalgic, but because it finally meets the conditions global trade demands. At the most basic level, the shift underway produces a simple outcome. Canadian producers gain options, and American logistics firms lose exclusivity. But beneath that simplicity lies a profound redistribution of power across North American trade. For decades, Canadian exporters operated within a constrained decision space. Southern routes were not chosen because they were ideal in every case, but because alternatives were either unreliable or non-existent. When exporters negotiated freight rates, storage contracts, or port access, they did so knowing that their counterpart controlled the bottlenecks. That reality shaped pricing long before any invoice was issued. Optionality changes that calculus entirely. When a producer can credibly route shipments north rather than south, negotiations begin from a different premise. Rail rates are no longer accepted as given. Port fees become negotiable. Scheduling priorities can be contested. Even small volumes diverted through alternative corridors exert disproportionate pressure on incumbent systems, because logistics networks are optimized for predictability, not sudden competition. The United States will continue to handle a substantial share of Canadian trade. That is neither surprising nor undesirable. Geography, infrastructure scale, and existing relationships ensure continued integration. What disappears is automatic reliance. That distinction is critical. When trade flows by default, infrastructure owners extract rents without resistance. When trade flows by choice, infrastructure owners must compete. Competition compresses margins, redistributes bargaining power, and weakens leverage that once appeared structural. Once Canadian exporters demonstrate that northern routes are viable, not experimentally but consistently, the entire pricing structure of cross-border logistics begins to shift. Southern corridors must justify their costs rather than impose them. Discounts offered temporarily to retain volume become permanent concessions. Service levels improve not because of regulation, but because alternatives exist. And there is no mechanism by which Washington can prevent this transformation. Tariffs do not stop domestic infrastructure investment. Trade agreements do not compel exporters to use foreign railways. Diplomatic pressure cannot force Canadian firms to ignore lower cost, sovereign routes if they exist. The change is not legal or political, it is physical. Steel rails, reinforced roadbeds, Arctic ports, and shipping lanes cannot be sanctioned out of existence. That is why the impact extends beyond individual firms. Entire regional economies in the northern United States, rail hubs, storage terminals, port operators, have quietly benefited from Canadian dependence for generations. Those revenues were treated as stable, almost natural. They were not. They were contingent. And that contingency is now exposed. Infrastructure determines power in ways policy rarely can. Political speeches fade. Trade disputes resolve or recur. Administrations change. But railways, ports, and corridors shape behavior for decades. They define what is easy, what is costly, and what is possible. By investing in northern corridors, Canada is not rejecting trade with the United States. It is rejecting asymmetry. Those two positions are often confused, but they are fundamentally different. Interdependence implies mutual vulnerability. Dependence implies one-sided exposure. For much of the modern era, Canada's Western economy operated under the latter condition. Access to global markets existed, but on terms largely dictated elsewhere. That reality limited policy flexibility long before any explicit threat was issued. The Hudson Bay Railway challenges that condition at its foundation. It demonstrates that sovereignty is not an abstract principle declared in legislation or diplomacy. It is constructed. It exists in ballast and steel. It exists in predictive maintenance systems and reinforced bridges. It exists in shipping contracts signed with European buyers that never transit foreign ports. Sovereignty in this sense is logistical. It is the ability to move goods without asking permission. It is the ability to choose routes based on economics rather than constraint. It is the capacity to absorb pressure without capitulation because alternatives exist. That is why this project matters far beyond Manitoba, far beyond Indigenous ownership, and far beyond a single railway. It represents a structural correction, an attempt to realign Canada's physical trade architecture with its political autonomy. Few countries ever undertake such corrections because they are expensive, slow, and politically unglamorous. But when they succeed, they permanently alter the balance of power. For most of its existence, the Hudson Bay Railway was treated as a cautionary tale, a reminder of ambition outpacing capability, a project cited as evidence that northern geography was simply too hostile, too costly, too marginal to matter. What has changed is not the map. What has changed is technology that can manage permafrost rather than surrender to it. Geopolitics that reward redundancy rather than efficiency alone. And intent. The willingness to invest not for immediate profit, but for long-term independence. When pressure arrived, Canada did not retreat inward. It did not rely solely on protest or policy. It invested outward. It turned north. It revived a corridor that had always existed, but had never been fully enabled. Trade routes, once redirected, rarely revert to their old paths. Supply chains adapt. Contracts adjust. Habits form. Infrastructure teaches markets how to behave. And that is a quiet reality confronting American logistics companies today. A flow of goods they once assumed was permanently anchored to their networks is learning to move differently. Not because it must, but because, for the first time in a century, it can.